So for this week on CyberSchool, we're actually talking about a new product again. It's been a while since we've been able to go over a new product. It was a weird thing for me adjusting to working for a tech company where, in my past jobs, working in food service, we'd come out with new stuff every month or, every couple of weeks. We'd always be launching a new drink at Starbucks or some new variation of a burger at McDonald's. And, switching over to a tech company, when we do releases, it's like maybe a couple times a year. So it's always really exciting when we come out with a new product. And one of our product lines that we don't talk about as much, but are a huge mover for us, and those that are in the know love these products, are our networking switches. So that's one of the new products that we released today, we released it last week, but this is kind of our first formal video that we're doing about it. And this is the new 2-port IP67 802.3BT to 802.3AT PoE Gigabit Switch, part number 011359. So this is a new product that we came out with. We've been doing a lot of these different little network switches, basically these splitters that turn one drop into two drops. Essentially a switch. We call them a splitter. They kind of have different names depending on who you're talking to. But this is one of the new products that we came out with that really helps with powering louder products in an indoor environment. And this is one that, I was really looking forward to do a CyberSchool for. And before we really get into talking about this product in general, I wanted to talk about PoE and PoE classes, because that's important to understand before we get into the nuances of what the heck 802.3BT actually means. So to get started, what is PoE? You probably hear this term tossed around all the time when you're talking about anything with VoIP, or even, really just about like anything that would be in, say, access control or video surveillance. PoE is a term that's thrown around a lot, and that means power over Ethernet. Basically using the same Ethernet cables that supply a data connection to these different devices to also supply power. So that way you accomplish everything with a single cable. You've got that power connection and that data connection all through that single cable, which makes just installing these products that much easier. So PoE, or power over Ethernet, was first introduced in 2003 with the standard 802.3AF, which standardized at 15.4 watts of DC power. That was pretty common, and you'll find that most VoIP products today with exclusions to some of our products like loudspeaker amplifiers or speakers, but like your standard desk phone and even most intercoms will just use standard PoE power. That's 802.3AF power. But commonly, this is kind of funny that, right around 2009 was when 802.3AT, commonly known as PoE Plus, started, 25.5 watts. That was right about the time that this little company, CyberData, came out with an IP speaker, and everybody thought we were crazy. It's just kind of interesting how these things kind of coincide. But 802.3AT was basically the second revision of the standard of power over Ethernet for devices that were a little bit more power hungry, stuff that needs a little bit more power. And we'll go over some examples of some PoE AT level devices a little bit later, but things like speakers, our loudspeaker amplifiers, and different types of surveillance cameras will commonly use that PoE Plus or that 802.3AT power. But as things go, power standards always just have to keep increasing because people get, kind of complicit with the existing power that they have and the existing features. And as humans, we always want to add more to it. So there just became a demand for even more power than that 25.5 watts that's supplied by 802.3AT power. So in 2018, they came out with 802.3BT power, sometimes known as PoE Plus. This one has a few different names, but in my research, I found that PoE Plus was the most common way that people referred to it as, with the exclusion, of course, of using the formal standard number, which is 802.3BT. And this one is a little bit strange. Instead of the other two powers that we've discussed, AF being 15.4 watts and AT being 22.5, BT can actually be two different power levels. either 15 watts or 71.3 watts, which is a little strange, seeing that a single standard can actually be multiple watts, but we'll get into that a little bit more. That's defined in the classes as we get further into this definition. And these different levels are kind of split into groups internally, and they're known as classes or groups. Those names are kind of interchangeable. So why the heck would you want to use PoE? I mean, being a millennial myself, having a ton of tech equipment, why the heck would you want to use like an Ethernet cable or anything like that? You have Wi-Fi, don't you? It's 2021. Don't you have Wi-Fi? Well, honestly, I think one of the main reasons that PoE is stuck around and been so standardized is because it was developed and in place before Wi-Fi became popular and before Wi-Fi became reliable. Really, especially for enterprise level situations, when you're dealing with a big office building, Wi-Fi is just not practical when, say, you've got, 100 different accountants at, say, some big Fortune 500 company, that are all trying to, connect to maybe 2 or 3 Wi-Fi access points on a network. You've got all of that, traffic flying through the air. Stuff gets kind of congested, and Ethernet just fixes that problem because it gives a dedicated connection for every single device that's going to be trying to transmit things. So that's why you don't see Wi-Fi as much in a lot of VoIP related stuff, but also because when you're dealing with Wi-Fi, then you have to have some other way to supply power. If you're using an Ethernet cable, the majority of people that are connecting anything via Ethernet are likely powering it as well. Of course, you're not necessarily doing that with, say, your desktop workstation, but your other peripherals, your VoIP phone, your intercom that's at your front door, the strobe light that's up on the wall, those are all typically powered via PoE because they're not Wi-Fi based devices, and you got to plug them into the network anyway. So you might as well supply power that way too. And that's one of the big kind of selling points for just using PoE as you're kind of speccing out a deployment, is because using PoE lowers that cabling requirements. If you just think about it at a base level, okay, I need to set up this particular device. I need a data cable and I need a power cable. And if you can combine those cables, that just means one less cable to manage. So it makes it a lot easier as you're designing all of, say, the AC power outlet requirements for, say, a workstation. Okay, they're going to need, say, 2 AC wall drops. And, as you're trying to spec out a building, understanding and deciding with going with PoE really reduces the number of cabling that can be required at a specific location. Say, for example, you're just setting up that regular workstation where somebody's got their regular desktop workstation, then they've got 2 monitors and a VoIP phone. If you're thinking about it under normal circumstances without PoE, you're dealing with 4 power connections there. 1 for the computer, 1 for each of the monitors, and then 1 for that phone that they're using. And that's without anything else that they might have on their desk, because people always like to plug things into their power strips. And if you think about it, that's already 4 basically AC plugs that you have to plug into a power strip. Well, if you're using PoE, that's 1 less AC plug that you need to be able to plug into a particular station, which really reduces that requires for cabling as you're going and making these installations. And one nice thing when you're dealing with PoE, you don't need an electrician to go out and maybe run those cables or actually deal with these complex installations. Whereas, say, if you need another AC wall outlet, the actual thing in the wall where you would plug, regular power cables into, you should probably get an electrician to install one of those things. But when you're dealing with PoE cables, you don't really need an electrician, which means 1 less person at the job. Electricians are usually fairly expensive to have out. So that means, if you do have to have an electrician out, they're not dealing with, simple PoE cabling that you can have some intern or some, kind of greenhorn or apprentice at this particular company that's doing the installation handle all the PoE cables. And then you can have that high dollar electrician deal with what he needs to deal with and then get the heck out of Dodge because he's expensive. So there's a lot of reasons that you want to use PoE. Another one is that the PoE Ethernet cables are just that much more reliable as compared to Wi-Fi, where if you've got a lot of devices that are competing for signal based on the channels with Wi-Fi, stuff can get locked out. You can have speed throughput issues. It's just generally not as good as Ethernet, where if you need speed and power, Ethernet is the right way to go, because when you've got that dedicated Ethernet drop, you've likely got a guaranteed gigabit speed output based on, essentially if you're using, any kind of modern networking equipment, as long as, it's a modern PC made in the last 10 years and a switch made in the last 10 years, you're basically guaranteed at 1 gigabit per second speed. So you've got really good speed when you're using an Ethernet cable, which is just a really good benefit. If speed is at all a concern for any of your traffic pass-through, Ethernet is the way to go, hands down. There's not even any questions to it. And the other nice thing when you're dealing with PoE is, we've covered a couple different standards, of course, 15.4 watts, 25.5, and then 61 and 73.3. I've dealt with a lot of different power supplies. There are so many more that are tied into PoE. We're really just hitting on the big ones. So if you need something as, say, simple as like a regular USB style connection, just 5 watt or 5 volts, you can do that through PoE, and you can go all the way up even past what we're discussing today. So power supply levels are just about there for any power requirement that your device might have. You can typically utilize that with PoE. So it's really, really versatile. It's great to put into just about any development or any location that you're going to be speccing and building. So now let's talk a little bit more about the PoE types and classes. So first, kind of our standard one, we've got type 1 or class 0. This is basically your standard PoE, your regular Yealink or your poly desk phone that they slap down on your desk, and you plug in a network cable and it just kind of boots up to life. You're amazed because you didn't plug in any AC power adapters or anything like that. That's kind of your standard PoE. And that one is, again, 802.3AF. The minimum power per wattage is 12.95 watts, and your maximum is that 15.4. You'll see that we're typically just quoting the maximums when we're dealing with the power in just general discussion. Typically, you're going to want to be using as a standard for any of these connections, whether it's type 1 or type 4, you're almost always going to want to be using either Cat5e or Cat6 cabling. Technically speaking, for some of the lower powers, you can use other versions of Cat cable. There's even sometimes you can do like Cat3, your regular 4-wire old school telephone cable. But generally, when you're dealing with anything like this, you're going to be using either Cat5, Cat5e, or Cat6 typically. And then the power over pairs is really not related to this discussion. We're not going to get into these details because this is just super high level engineering stuff. Frankly, it's not important, at least for this particular conversation. But the power over pairs in our chart here, that column basically tells you how many pairs are used for data and how many pairs are used for power. And then when you're dealing with type 1 or type 2, they're always going to be using 2 pairs or 4 wires for power. And when you step it down to class 4 is really tricky at an engineering level where it's using all 4 pairs, not only for data transmission, but also for power. It's really tricky how it works. Again, really outside of the scope of this discussion. We're not getting into it. There are much better videos on YouTube that go over, the actual pinouts and how the data works and all the science behind that, way beyond the scope of our video today. So that's basically a good explanation of the chart in type 1 or class 0. As we move to type 2, our PoE plus, the second row here in the chart, we've got 802.3AT. The minimum power is 25 watts and the maximum is 30 watts, again, using that Cat5e cable. This one's commonly known as PoE plus. You'll notice in our class number, we actually jumped going from class 0 for our type 1, and then our type only increased by 1 to type 2, but our class jumped to 4. And in between that class 1 and class 4, there are still class 1, class 2, and class 3, and those deal with kind of the specific special powers that can be necessary in between. So say your typical 5-volt that would be equivalent to a USB connection, and there are a couple others, but they're not really used in VoIP and telecom, so we won't really be discussing those today. We'll typically just be sticking with our type 1 through type 4. And as we move on to our type 3 and type 4, these two are kind of grouped because as you'll notice here on our chart in our standard column, 802.3BT actually stands for type 3 and type 4. And this is where it can get a little confusing with this BT level because BT level essentially means when we're just looking at the wattage, it could mean anywhere between the minimum of 51 watts upwards to 100 watts. And that's all kind of encompassed in this BoE 802.3BT power level. Type 3 or type 4. When you're dealing with type 3, you're typically restricted to this 51 watt through 60 watts. And then when you're dealing with your type 4, we're dealing with our 71 to 90 watts with a maximum of 100 watts. So it's really 71 to 100 watts. And it gets real complicated as we go through the different class levels, where the class levels just specify, okay, a type 3 class 5 means that it only deals with that 51 watts, where a type 3 class 6 would need that whole 60 watts. So it gives you, since 802.3 BT is such a wide range, the classes are split up as such to help understanding, where you instead of just having, say, an 802.3 BT level device, which, as we can tell from our chart here, could literally be anywhere between 51 to 100 watts, having that tied with that type and class helps you better understand the actual power requirements of these particular devices. So now that we kind of understand PoE and what all these different types and classes mean, let's pull back to CyberData. What types of power do CyberData devices use? Well, our products typically only use standard PoE 802.3 AF or PoE Plus, more commonly known as 802.3 AT power. And some good examples of our standard PoE level devices are things like our intercoms, and that can be both our what we call a single button intercom or our keypad intercoms. Both varieties are still only going to be just that standard PoE devices, but then other devices that you might not essentially consider, you might think actually require more power. Things like strobes. You've got that big blinky light on the wall. That one still only needs that 15.4 watts of power. Same thing with our call buttons. Call buttons are pretty self-explanatory. They're basically intercoms without the microphone or without the speaker. So in reality, those ones are really easy to understand. Heck, we could even power those things with less power just because they don't have to go and produce sound or actually record any sound. Then things like our multicast speakers are one of our newer products that are in this standard PoE class, where they only use that 15.4 watts, but we still drive them at a pretty good sound level. So they make them really easy to go and spec out as you're dealing with a paging system for a particular client. As we move towards our PoE Plus compliant devices, you got things like what we call our SIP speakers. And these are our full-fledged speakers. While our full-fledged SIP speakers do support multicast, there is a distinct difference between our multicast speakers and our SIP speakers. And that's why we typically refer to them at CyberData as multicast speakers and then SIP speakers, just to help differentiate. Where the multicast speakers only do multicast, the SIP speakers do SIP, multicast, line in, line out. They do a whole bunch more. And with all those extra features, they want that little bit of extra power. So that's why those are designed for PoE Plus. And then our other device family that really falls into this PoE Plus level category would be our SIP IP66 horn, our paging amplifier, and our loudspeaker amplifier. And these three products all use the same underlying hardware. They all use the same board from the paging amplifier that's really the brains behind it. And that's why they all kind of fall into this category. When you're thinking about CyberData products, if it's something that makes a sound and a lot of sound, it's probably going to be a PoE Plus based device. Not to say that our standard PoE devices, like our multicast speakers, aren't loud. The devices that require PoE Plus are just louder because they got more power, which means more sound. Easy way to think about it. So now that we've kind of covered CyberData products and what power usages they use, let's actually talk about the new product. I started the video just kind of talking about how excited I am for this new product, and we haven't even talked about it. So we've got our new, again, 2-port IP67 802.3 BT to 802.3 AT PoE Gigabit Switch. The part number for that one is 011539, as you can see in the image up here on the top, and a nice little size dimensions down here on the bottom. You can see that it's 6.686 inches or 169.83 millimeters. So it's a pretty small unit. It's definitely bigger than our other switches that we have, but this one's really good. It's IP67 rated, so technically speaking, if anybody's watched our past CyberSchool on IP ratings and how to preserve it, we know that an IP67 rated device means that it's dust proof from that 6 in our first number, and the 7 means that it's submersion rated upwards for up to 15 minutes with up to 1 meter of water. Of course, this really isn't something that you want to do full submersion. It's not something that you're going to go and say put out in the middle of Monterey Bay and power some speakers or something out there. It's definitely something that can get wet, shouldn't be submerged. But if you need to, say if you're running a cable run out to say a guard shack that would be on a driveway, say leading up to some big corporate office or say a mining area, you could actually bury one of these switches, which is pretty cool. You could go connect all your cables, make sure that everything's good and cinched up, and bury it. If I were going to do something like that, I'd want to put it in a box so that way I could get to it easily. I'd hate to have to get out a shovel and dig around to try to get this thing out. But it's technically capable of being buried if you wanted to opt for something like that. This thing is 802.3bt. Technically, this is our Type 4. Of course, being Type 4, that means it can still also do Type 3. So it can supply either power if you need kind of the lower end of BT, that 51 watts, or all the way up to the 100 watts that you might need for BT. So you've got a lot of flexibility out of the switch. So basically, anything you need to power on the other end, you can with one of these things. And the nice thing with these, and we'll get into a little bit more of the use cases, this makes it really easy to take a single drop and split it into two. So say, for example, you've got a video camera out in your parking lot, but you also want to have some kind of paging equipment out there. You can take one of these guys and slap it in between your connection, between, say, the switch that was already powering and controlling that video camera that's out there. You put our switch in the middle, and then you've got that other connection that can run off to that horn, and both devices can be powered. And since this is a gigabit level device, you'll still have that same throughput capability with that video camera that you would expect. And when you need to make announcements, you'll still be able to get those announcements off, all with that single port connection on your switch that's back in your server room. You're powering and controlling two devices with that single PoE cable going out. Since the video camera is obviously going to need more bandwidth, it's got all that bandwidth, and then the paging device, when it needs to make a page, it can do that without sacrificing that bandwidth capability for that video camera and without having to run another wire drop out there to be able to do it. It's absolutely perfect for these types of scenarios. That's honestly how I see this thing getting used the most. It's just going to be out there in the wild powering both a camera and one of our paging devices. But one of the big things, like you're thinking, oh my gosh, this thing is 90 watts? How the heck are you going to power this thing? That's a lot of power. And when you're dealing with something that's a BT level endpoint, not that many PoE endpoints you're going to find distinctly need that 802.3 BT power level. It's kind of rare, but there is hardware out there, of course, excluding this switch that just kind of splits that power. There are devices out there that need that kind of power. And when you're dealing with this high level of power, typically your regular, say your 24 or your 36 port, switch that you've got in your server room, say you went out and got one of those fancy Cisco switches, you dropped a few $1,000s on it, you didn't break the bank on it, you didn't go for, the one that Cisco tried to sell you that's like $10,000. You didn't break the bank, you went for the one that's, $2,500. Still a good amount of money spent on one of these switches, but most of these big switches can't actually supply BT Type 4 level power. They can't supply that full 100 watts of power, which just leaves you thinking, okay, how the heck do people actually power these things? Well, that comes down to small dedicated switches. I'm literally talking 4 to 6 port switches that are designed for all of these ports being capable of BT power. So most people typically opt for just a single switch that's going to be able to power all of the devices that are connected to it. Again, because it's got that standard AC wall out connection, so it gets that full power, and it's only got 4 to 6 ports. So that way, it's really, really limiting the available power bandwidth to these different ports to be able to supply these high power devices. But even those switches are fairly expensive. Just doing some quick Google, using my Google food, checking Amazon, you're still looking at a couple $100 for one of these, 4 to 6 port switches. So that's where I find it, just kind of crawling through different forums, and for people that were actually using this power level, which I found kind of few and far between, a lot of people opt for Ethernet injectors to actually supply power instead of going out and buying a dedicated switch. Say if they've only got one device that needs that BT power, instead of going out and buying, a 4 to 6 port switch, spending all that money, just buy an injector instead. So that way that can sit in between your standard 24 or 32 port switch and just supply the additional power necessary to whatever's on the far end. So for example, our splitter that could be powering two different AT level devices. So something like our IP66 horn and a pan tilt zoom camera. But the one thing that you want to be cognizant of when you're trying to spec out, okay, how the heck am I going to power one of these switches, is whatever you get to actually power it must meet the 802.3 BT Type 4 power requirements. Again, just finding something that states, okay, yeah, this is an 802.3 BT level power injector, but doesn't talk about the type or doesn't talk about the class, that could very well only be a 51 watt power injector, because remember, BT is anywhere between 51 watt to 100 watts. So you really want to make sure anything that you're looking to actually power this switch is going to be either Type 3 or Type 4, depending on the actual power requirements of what you plan on connecting after our switch. So next, let's talk about how you would actually use one of these switches. I've kind of commented about it a little bit, but let's talk a little bit more in depth on ways that this thing could be used. So of course, coming out from your network room, imagine you're in your network room and you're trying to figure out, okay, how does the pathing for this actually go? Well, depending on the network switches that you have, if you've got one of these, fancy switches that can do the 802.3 BT Type 4 power connection, you can just plug in a Cat5 cable right there. But if you don't have that capability, go ahead and instead plug that Cat cable into that power injector. So that way you've got your power supply there. And you take that cable that's connected to either your injector or your switch and then plug that into the CyberData switch, that 2-port IP67 802.3 BT to 802.3 AT PoE Gigabit Switch, port number 011359. So that way you've got basically up to that CyberData switch powered, everything's good to go there. And then you take your devices that you actually want to split that BT level power to. Because remember, all our switch is doing is splitting that BT level power into two AT level powers. So that way you can power two more high power or PoE plus level devices. So a common example of that, and what I think a lot of people, at least that are CyberData customers that end up using a switch like this, would be powering our IP60 or SIP IP66 outdoor horn, part number 011457. Anybody that's watching CyberSchool knows that this is my absolute favorite product from CyberData. And the other option they could plug in there, kind of like the initial example that we talked about, this thing is mounted on a light post out in your parking lot, would have one of these nice PTZ or pan tilt zoom camera, which means that you've got that full, imagine back to, oh my gosh, some of those cool 80s movies where they're trying to get in and break into a building and they've got that, guy, that security guard that's sitting there. He's supposed to be watching the cameras, and thank goodness he's not, because the hero of the movie is sneaking through and caught on the cameras, and the security guard is sitting there, watching something on his little TV. He's watching a boxing match or something, and he's got that joystick right in front of him. And that joystick was typically used to control the pan and tilt of the camera, and there's typically a knob on there that would control the zoom. So when you've got a PTZ camera that's a pan and tilt, so that means it can move vertically, it can move on the vertical axis as well as the horizontal axis, and it can zoom in and out. So you've basically got a fully mobile camera that can go and look at anything, it kind of move around. They're great for on the corners of buildings. And when you're using a camera like that, they almost always need the PoE AT level power to be able to control the servo motors that actually go and move the camera around in its nice, weatherproof enclosure, kind of like we have pictured there, where it's got this little dome that the camera's in. So typically when you're dealing with something like that, you need this AT level power supply, which makes it perfect for our switch, because the IP66 horn that you're going to be attaching to the other side also needs that AT level power. So this is one of the probably most common encounters that I think we'll have for one of these units. But another key example, and one that you could use indoors, because just because this thing is IP67 rated doesn't mean that it only has to be used outside. You could still absolutely use this thing inside. You could power one of our SIP speakers that could be running an analog speaker off the side of it, so say right by a bathroom. So that way you've got your SIP speaker in one bathroom, say in the women's room, and then you've got the analog speaker in the men's room. So that way you've got, paging in both bathrooms, and say you've got a Wi-Fi access point that's right outside. So that way when people are, in the loo taking their time, they've got, great connection to be able to go and check Twitter and Facebook as they're in the can. So you've got that great capability, and this thing's really useful. It doesn't necessarily just have to be used outside. It can be used inside, basically any place that you would need two AT level drops and you've only got one Ethernet cable to work with that goes back to your network room. This is an absolute perfect switch for this type of scenario. But another key example is it doesn't have to be something that would, say, be a Wi-Fi access point or a camera. It could be two CyberData devices if you want. You could stick two IP66 horns facing in opposite directions on, say, the corner of a building or on a light post out in a parking lot. So that way you get really good paging coverage to both sides of your parking lot. Really, the possibilities are endless because when you throw the switch in the middle, you've got two different connections to connect whatever devices you want to. And you could absolutely, if you wanted to, just connect your standard, say your IP66 horn to one connection and just do your regular PoE AF level. You could stick in, say, an intercom that could go right there, or a non-pan tilt zoom camera that would typically only need your standard PoE, your class 0, your type 1. You've got a lot of options and flexibility. It doesn't always have to be those AT level devices. It should, because that's why you're spending all this extra money on this really fancy, expensive splitter switch, but you can really connect anything in there. So these are just some ideas on how to actually use this thing out in the wild. So now that we've kind of talked about it, kind of the nuts and bolts of it, you know how to use it, how the heck do you install this thing? Because that's kind of an important thing for it. So for this thing, to actually go and install it, you'll notice in our diagram here that on the four corners of the mounting bracket, we've got these little slotted keyholes. So that's going to be a really easy way to go and mount it. You just run a couple screws through and you slide the screw heads through the keyholes and kind of cinch it to where the thinner part of the keyhole is. I mean, everybody's hung a painting or used something like this, so that way you can't pull the screws out. And you just tighten those screws up, and then if you like, you can go and add two additional screws in the bottom keyholes to get 4 points of contact on the mounting brackets. That way the thing really stays in place. This thing is nice as it comes, assuming that you go and actually connect the gland nuts that actually hold the cables in there secure. You really don't need to worry about this thing too much. The enclosure itself is IP67 rated, so as long as the 3 points of entry are secured, basically where the networking cable side comes in from your networking closet, your networking room, or your main switch, and then out to your two devices, as long as these 3 points of entry or ingress points are sealed up and properly taken care of, there's nothing to worry about. If this thing's out there in the rain, sleet, or snow, it's like the USPS. It'll be just fine if it's out there. So there's no additional sealing that could be required. Can commonly be required for things like, say, our intercoms. If you're going to be mounting those out there, you really want to make sure that that thing is sealed up and good to go. Well, this thing is not really as necessary as long as you deal with the cable installation correctly. And as such, the cable installation is the most complicated part of this installation because it's really the only point for the IP67 rating to fail. IP67 rating is only as good as what you connect into it. If you miss any points, say you miss this sealing washer that's very important that goes right here in the middle, this whole side could be fine, but you're missing this washer, water can seep in here and kill the switch. So you really want to do your due diligence when you're going and mounting one of these things. So what I would recommend, if I were going and installing one of these, I would first take your Ethernet cable that's going to plug into the switch and run that through the big sealing nut. So you basically want to just go and take the whole thing apart, get all your different parts and pieces, and run the sealing nut over it. And that just kind of gives you basically, that's your end. That's what's going to clamp down and keep everything secure. Then you stick your split gland in there in the middle. It's basically this big kind of rubber loop that's split on one side. So that way that just kind of forms over your cable. And then you pass your cable through the big gland body here. So this is the part with fins that people that have used any of our IP66 rated devices will commonly know these fins. This is super common with not even just CyberData products, but anything that's going to be IP66 or higher rated that's going to be outdoors is going to have these little locking fins that with the sealing nut clamp down on the split gland that goes right in the middle. So you'll just want to feed your cable through this gland nut and of course through this sealing washer that's super duper important. And then finally just plug your cable into the interior switch here. And then you want to go and start to cinch in your gland body into the actual housing of the switch itself and get all that there. Of course, making sure that the sealing washer makes good contact with the actual enclosure and the side of the gland nut as you tighten that down. Then you feed the split gland into basically the teeth part of the gland body, so that way everything can kind of cinch down on there. And then finally, thread the sealing nut over the fins here, making sure that it's got a good grasp on the split gland, and just get that thing good and tight. You'll notice based on the illustration and the pictures that we've shown that this thing is keyed and you could use a wrench on it, but I would honestly recommend against it. You know, anybody that's, knows the business end of a wrench will know that you should really be careful when you're dealing with any plastic fittings like that because it's really easy to crack them. You can't always tell when you crack them, and when you crack them, they're done. You can't save it. So you want to be real careful. We recommend just going as hand tight as you can because you're not likely going to break it just by going hand tight as long as you're not, Arnold Schwarzenegger. You're not really going to run into one of those problems. And that's basically how you go and properly secure an Ethernet cable into one side. And if you've done one side, you got two more to go, but you'll be a regular expert at doing this. You'll do the exact same process for the business side of the our splitter switch here, and where you actually plug in the two products that you want to power. And the final thing that you'll want to do after you get everything wired up is just connect your ground wire here. Grounding is super duper important, especially when you're doing anything that's outdoors, electrical equipment. Grounding, I couldn't tell you how many different support tickets we've gotten that have been resolved just by adding, which we call out in all of our documentation. We even have some stickers on some of our devices to ground your equipment. I really couldn't tell you how many problems have been solved just by a simple ground nut on there. When you're dealing with especially outdoor equipment, stuff that people will interact with, you get static shocks that can build up on there. But when you're dealing with stuff that's outdoors, say that's mounted up on a pole, you got to think about it. That thing is just out there in the wind, and that thing will just generate a static shock, especially in the kind of autumn, early fall months where it's real windy, the air's real dry. Equipment will just build up a static shock, and that provides the capability to potentially damage the hardware. Not as common. It does happen, but it's pretty rare, but it can cause them to malfunction where they can stop responding, they can hang up, you got to reboot them every once in a while, only between, say, like August and September. That can all be related to just a grounding issue. So that grounding is so important when you're dealing with any electrical equipment. That's kind of the installation and setup in general. So now let's kind of summarize everything. When you're dealing with PoE, it is the best possible connection option if connection speed is at all important. If connection speed is something that you're concerned about, say you've got video editors or document people that need to be able to push big documents really quickly to other people that are working on them, you always want to go for that Ethernet connection. Again, not really related to VoIP, because with VoIP you're dealing with such small traffic that connection option and speed isn't as important. But when you're, say, sharing a connection like you would be with the IP67 splitter, you would need that kind of speed capability that you can get with a regular Ethernet connection. The video camera that you have on the end is going to be a lot more impacted by a slow network speed as compared to, say your SIP speaker that is playing, kilobytes of data at a time, whereas your camera is pushing a lot of data, especially if that's, say, a 4K camera. That thing's pushing a lot of data. And on that, you've got more reliability when you're dealing with Ethernet in general. Of course, it's supplying your network and your power connection, but it doesn't drop off and it isn't spotty like you can get with Wi-Fi connections. And the other nice selling point to using power over Ethernet is just you've got power and data with a single cable. So that really reduces the amount of cabling that you have to do. You know, if you've got to do full cable runs for everything, I'd rather run one cable than two because it's just, you know, less money to run less cable. And it also helps with cable management, which is helpful for workstations, but also kind of out of the box places where you wouldn't necessarily consider cable management, things like checkout lanes or POS stations. Cable management is super duper important, and just using PoE reduces the amount of cables that you have. So then to pull onto our splitter, this is an awesome option when you're dealing with high level or high power devices. If you're not dealing with, say, two devices that need super high bandwidth capability, say two 4K cameras, this is a great option. But if you've got one camera and you need another device that doesn't need as much of a connection speed, say you've got a camera and one of our IP66 horns, the splitter is an awesome option instead of having to do a second run either to replace the connection for the camera or to add in that horn or one of our speakers. You can do that with a single drop and just throw our splitter in the middle. And again, because it's IP67 rated, it doesn't just have to go outside. You can still use this thing indoors as well. And with that, being able to split that one drop into two really, again, reduces your cabling cost. Same thing with PoE. Reducing any amount of cable that you have to use is always going to be a benefit because it's less copper you got to buy and less copper you got to run from point A to point B. And all those things add up. It starts nickel and diamond a little bit, but all that kind of adds up as you go. And the nice thing with the IP rating, that IP67 rating, as long as you get all those cables actually connected to the interior switch sealed up properly, that thing is fine to go in any environment. It could be outdoors, way up in the boonies, up in Canada, dealing with a mining operation, or it could, be down at, hot tropic, Keys, Florida, where it gets real hot, real humid. They, get all that kind of stuff. It's IP66 rated, so as long as it's, say, not in a place in Florida that's prone to flooding, because unfortunately the IP67 rating wouldn't stand up to a flood, but it can be used in just about any environment as long as the IP rating is something that you can consider and put out there. So with these two options, they're really, really great options and great to add to your repertoire and good options to have if you get a client that has very particular needs for an installation. So finally, let's just go over a couple terms that we used. This one we kind of beat to death, but PoE just means power over Ethernet. It's the best way to supply power and data connectivity to a device. DC power, that doesn't mean DC comics. This is DC power or direct current electricity. That, without going into a whole, that's a whole other YouTube video on its own. Watch those. There's way better YouTube videos that explain what DC power is. It's just electricity. That's all you need to know for this conversation. Wi-Fi, of course, for anybody that doesn't know what that means, is just a wireless network connection. Wi-Fi is actually a standard. PTZ means pan, tilt, and zoom. And WAP means Wi-Fi access point. There are songs out there that use that same thing, use that same term, but in this context, we are talking about a Wi-Fi access point.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.